told me on my very first day that there were 14 rooms in that house, and I was only ever to clean 13 of them. And when I asked which one to skip, he pointed to a door at the end of the upstairs hallway with no number on it, and said, simply, "That one stays shut, and I want you to understand that I needed that job badly enough that I didn't ask a second question, and I have thought about that decision almost every day since." This happened the summer after I dropped out of college, broke, staying with an aunt in a small farming town I barely knew, and she mentioned that a widower a few miles out, a man everyone just called Farmer Holt, was looking for someone to help around the property, light housework, some cooking, general upkeep, in exchange for room, board, and a small weekly wage, and I took it without thinking twice, because I needed somewhere to be that wasn't my aunt's guest room. The farmhouse itself was the kind of place you see in old photographs. 2 stories, wrap-around porch, more land than one old man could possibly need. And Holt himself was quiet in a way that felt practiced rather than natural, like a man who had trained himself out of saying things rather than a man who simply had nothing to say. He showed me around that first afternoon. Kitchen, sitting room, 4 bedrooms, a study full of ledgers going back decades, and then upstairs, at the very end of a hallway that ran the length of the house, that one door, plain wood, no lock visible from the outside, and when he told me it stayed shut, I asked, out of simple habit rather than real suspicion, if it was just storage, and he said, "It's where my wife kept her things," and something about the flatness of his voice told me not to ask a follow-up, so I didn't. My job was straightforward enough. Cook 2 meals a day, keep the house clean, help with small chores around the barn when he needed an extra pair of hands, and for the first week, nothing about it felt strange at all, beyond the ordinary strangeness of living alone, with a quiet old man, in a house too big for either of us. The first thing I actually noticed happened around day 9. I was dusting the hallway upstairs, and I found myself standing in front of that door longer than I meant to, not because anything was happening, just because something about its plainness bothered me. Every other door in that house had at least some detail, a scuff, a different shade of paint, a doorknob that didn't quite match the others, but this one was uniform in a way that felt less like age and more like maintenance. Like someone dusted and repainted that door regularly while making sure it never looked touched. And as I stood there, I noticed something at the base of it. A thin line of salt, not decorative, not the kind of thing you'd leave by accident. A careful, unbroken line laid along the entire bottom edge of the doorframe, and I remember crouching down to look closer and hearing Holt's voice behind me before I'd even heard him climb the stairs, asking, very calmly, if I needed something from that end of the hall, and I said no. And he said, "Then there's no reason to be down there." And I stood up and went back to dusting, and neither of us mentioned it again. But that night at dinner, he set a small dish of salt on the table without explanation, next to the pepper, and told me, almost as an aside, that if I ever noticed the line by that door had been disturbed, broken, scattered, anything other than a clean, unbroken line, I was to tell him immediately, day or night, and not to try to fix it myself. And I said okay, the way you say okay to a strange old man's strange old habit. And I want to be honest and say that for the first 2 weeks, I genuinely thought it was just grief, dressed up as ritual. An old man who'd lost his wife, finding small rules to hold on to, so the house still felt controlled. I've seen that kind of thing before, in people who are grieving, small rituals that don't make logical sense to anyone else, but hold the person's world together. And I told myself, that's all this was, until the morning I came downstairs and found Holt already up, sitting at the kitchen table, with his coat still on, like he'd been outside checking something before dawn. And when I asked if everything was all right, he said the line had moved overnight. Not broken, not scattered. Moved. Shifted about 2 inches inward from where it always sat, like something had nudged it from the inside of the room, rather than disturbed it from the hallway, and he spent that whole day repairing it, kneeling in the hallway with a small container of salt, laying the line back exactly where it belonged, with the kind of careful precision you'd use on something you didn't want to get wrong twice. And that was the first time I asked him directly what was actually in that room, and he didn't answer right away. He finished the line first, stood up, brushed off his knees, and told me a story instead of an explanation. He said that when he and his wife bought the property almost 40 years earlier, that room had already been sealed by the previous owner, boarded rather than locked, and that the previous owner had left a single instruction with the sale of the house, written on a card tucked into the doorframe, that whoever lived there next was never to fully open that room, only to maintain the boundary, keep it shut, keep a line of salt at the threshold, and check it every single day. And Holt said his wife had been the one who insisted on honoring it at first, out of superstition more than belief, and that over the decades, small things had happened often enough that neither of them ever felt safe enough to test whether the instruction had been foolish. He told me about nights early in his marriage, when they'd hear something that sounded almost like furniture being rearranged behind that door, slow, deliberate, never violent. Just the occasional scrape of something heavy being moved a few inches, and then stopping, always stopping before it became loud enough to be undeniable. He told me about a period in the 1990s when the temperature in that end of the hallway would drop noticeably for a few days at a stretch, always in the same week each year, always resolving on its own. And he told me, quietly, that his wife had died 6 years earlier, not in that room, not near it, in a hospital 40 minutes away, ordinary and explainable, but that in the weeks after her funeral, the salt line had needed repairing almost every single night, disturbed in some new small way each time, until he started sleeping in the chair at the end of the hallway, just so he'd notice the moment it happened, rather than finding it broken hours later. And eventually, he said, it settled back into its old rhythm, undisturbed for months at a time, occasionally shifting, always repairable. And he told me this, the way you'd explain a chore, not a horror, like he'd made his peace with living beside something he didn't understand, as long as the rules were followed. And for a while, after that conversation, I did exactly what he asked, checked the line every morning as part of my regular dusting round, reported anything unusual, never lingered, and things stayed quiet for almost 3 weeks. Quiet enough that I started to relax into the rhythm of the place. Quiet enough that I started to feel a little embarrassed about how seriously I'd taken an old man's grief ritual. And then, on a night Holt had gone into town to see a doctor and stayed over with a cousin rather than drive back in the dark, I was alone in that house for the first time since I'd started the job. And I heard it myself, the sound he'd described, that slow, deliberate scrape of something being dragged a few inches, and stopping, coming from behind that door at the end of the hallway. And I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, and I did not go check the line that night. I went back to my room, and I put a chair against my door, which I know now did absolutely nothing useful, but it felt like it did something at the time. And in the morning, the line was intact, completely undisturbed, exactly where it should have been. And I remember standing there, staring at it, feeling almost more unsettled by the fact that it was fine than I would have been if it had been broken, because it meant whatever had made that sound had been active and had still chosen, on its own, not to cross that threshold. And I started paying closer attention after that night. Not obsessively, but enough to notice a pattern I don't think Holt had ever fully laid out for me. The sounds only ever happened on nights when I was alone in the house, never on nights he was there too. And when I finally worked up the nerve to mention that to him directly, weeks later, he went very quiet and told me that his wife used to say something similar, that it seemed to know the difference between one person in the house and two, and that it behaved differently depending on who was alone with it. And when I asked him what that meant, whether it meant it was somehow more interested in me specifically than it had been in her, he didn't answer that question either. He just told me, very seriously, that I should never go into that hallway alone at night from that point on, and if I ever heard the sound again while alone, I should go straight to my room, put on music or anything with sound, loud enough to think over, and wait until morning, without going anywhere near the salt, and for a long while, months actually, that arrangement held. I followed the rule. The room stayed quiet on the nights I followed it exactly, and I genuinely started to believe I understood the shape of what I was dealing with, until the night everything changed, which was the night I woke up to find the hallway light already on outside my door, which it never was. Holt always turned every light off before bed, as a habit from a lifetime of watching pennies, and when I opened my door, the hallway was empty, but at the far end, the door to that room was standing open, not wide, just a few inches, enough for a sliver of darkness to show against the wall, and the salt line, instead of being broken or scattered, had been very carefully swept aside into two neat little piles on either side of the doorframe, like someone, or something, had cleared a path, rather than simply crossing over one. And I did not walk down that hallway. I want to be very clear about that. I stood at my door, and I called for Holt, and he didn't answer, and I called again, and eventually I heard him, not from his bedroom, but from downstairs, calling back up to me, asking what was wrong, and when I told him what I was looking at, he came up those stairs, faster than I had ever seen that old man move, and he stood beside me at the top, staring down that hallway at the open door and the swept salt, and I watched something happen on his face that I still think about. It wasn't panic exactly. It was closer to a kind of terrible familiarity, like he'd been waiting 6 years for this specific thing to happen, and some small, tired part of him was almost relieved the waiting was finally over. He told me to go downstairs and wait by the front door, and I did, and I heard him walk the length of that hallway alone, and I heard the door close, not slam, just close, quietly, deliberately, and I heard him kneel down and rebuild the salt line by hand, and when he finally came downstairs afterward, he looked 20 years older than he had at breakfast that same morning. He told me the room was empty, exactly as it should be. Nothing moved, nothing changed inside it, as far as he could tell, without fully entering, and that whatever had opened the door and swept the salt aside had, for whatever reason, chosen not to leave. He never gave me a reason why, and I never asked again, because some part of me understood by then that the not knowing was the entire arrangement, that the rule had never been about keeping something dangerous locked away so much as it had been about maintaining a kind of agreement, a truce that depended entirely on nobody involved fully understanding what they were agreeing to. I stayed on with Holt for another 4 months after that night, and the sounds continued on the same pattern as before, occasional, always on nights I was alone, always stopping short of the threshold, and I never heard that door open again, but I started sleeping with music playing every single night regardless of whether Holt was home, because I could never again fully trust that his presence was the variable that mattered. I left that job at the end of that summer for ordinary reasons, needing to go back and finish my degree, and Holt shook my hand at the door and thanked me for taking the salt seriously, which is a strange thing to be thanked for, and told me, almost as an afterthought as I was walking to my car, that the previous owner's instruction card, the one tucked into the doorframe when he and his wife first bought the place, had one more line on it that he'd never mentioned to me before, a line that said the arrangement would need a new caretaker again someday, and that when that day came, the house would let the right person know, and I asked him what that meant, and he just smiled, in a tired sort of way, and told me to drive safe, and I drove away from that farm that afternoon, and I have not been back since. But I still think about that hallway more than I'd like to admit, and about 6 months ago, I got a letter, no return address, just my name, in handwriting I didn't recognize, and inside was a single line, no signature, that read, "The salt needs someone again, and I don't know who sent it, and I have not called Holt to ask if he's all right, because some part of me is afraid of what I'll hear if I do. And some part of me, the part I'm least proud of, is more afraid of what it might mean if I call, and a stranger answers instead, telling me the old man is gone, and that the room at the end of the hallway is still exactly where it always was, waiting to see who notices the line has moved next. Subscribe to my channel today, Beyond the Veil Horror Story,